He's just a security guard, my dad told the wedding guests. He said it like a joke, like my whole life was a punchline. But then, the room shifted. A voice cut through the chatter. "Holy, he's on the news." Every head turned. The screen lit up with my face bloodied but standing tall, taking down armed men in a ballroom full of chaos. And right there, my father's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed louder than the gunshots I'd survived. My name is Ryan Cole. I never asked to be a hero. I only wanted my father to see me to believe I was more than the title he used to shame me. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story reached. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. And if my story makes you feel something, anger, sympathy, or even just a quiet nod, please hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to someone like me who spent years feeling invisible. The envelope was heavy in my hand, cream paper pressed with gold embossing that spelled out my father's name and his new bride's. I should have tossed it straight into the trash. Every instinct told me to rip it apart and walk away from yet another reminder that to him I was nothing more than a line on a guest list. But my eyes drifted to the watch sitting on my desk, the one I'd stopped wearing years ago. The second hand was frozen. The glass scratched, the strap cracked. It hadn't ticked in years, and yet I kept it because it was the last thing he'd ever given me. Time had stopped between us, and maybe I hadn't been able to move it forward either. That afternoon, I'd been wrapping up a security plan at Sentinel, charting emergency exits for a finance conference downtown. Jason Kim, my boss, gave me a rare nod of approval. "Sharp work, Cole. You saved us a liability headache." Praise that should have meant something, but all I could hear in the back of my mind was my father's voice from years ago. He's just a security guard. On the office bulletin, a news alert scrolled about a string of thefts hitting upscale events across the Northwest. I filed it away instinctively. Security was about seeing patterns before anyone else noticed them. I called my mom Linda on the walk back to my apartment in Queen Anne. She was at home, the hum of her kettle in the background. She always had warmth in her voice, even when she worried. She reminded me of the bedtime stories she used to read when I was a boy. Stories of guardians, men who stood between danger and the people they loved. "You can choose to go," she said softly, "or you can choose not to. But don't let his voice decide for you. Protect yourself, Ryan." Later that night, Tyler met me at a bar in Ballard. We'd shared foxholes and desert winds, and he was the one person who could call me on my... I showed him the invitation, my thumb pressing into the embossing. He smirked, shook his head, and said, "You don't go for him. You go because you can, to prove you don't need his permission to exist." He raised his beer like a challenge. Even so, the thought of walking into a ballroom full of my father's world, the bankers, the lawyers, the people who whispered, I should have been more stirred. Something darker. In group therapy for vets, I admitted as much. Crowds rattled me. Gunfire in my memory could still knock the wind out of me. The therapist told me to set an escape route, even if it was just in my head. "Breathe, observe, act," she repeated. That night, I opened the email invitation again, hovered over the RSVP link. My chest was tight, my father's words pressing down like a weight. But then I clicked confirmed. And when the auto-reply came back, I stared at it in disbelief. My seating assignment, service table vendor adjacent, not family, not even guest. It felt like a slap, another line drawn. I sat back staring at the broken watch on the desk. I told myself the same thing Id said in every firefight overseas, in or out. Decide. And I whispered into the silence, "Ill go." Whether to reconcile or to prove him wrong, I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing. Time had been frozen long enough. The bus rattled down the lakeside road, a far cry from the sleek limousines idling in front of the Cedar Lake Resort. I stepped off with my suitcase in hand, the August air heavy with the smell of fresh-cut grass and lake water. The place was a picture from a glossy magazine. Willow trees trailing their branches toward the water-glass walls gleaming in the sun, a private dock bobbing with boats. To me, it all felt like a world I'd never been invited into. At check-in, the receptionist scanned the QR code from my phone. Her smile faltered for a beat before she directed me toward the side wing of the property room 214 near the service corridor. The route there took me past hallways with fewer cameras than any resort should have. My eyes clocked it immediately. Coverage gaps, the kind that make you itch if you spent years mapping exits and choke points. By evening, I was at the rehearsal dinner. Round tables draped in linen orchids and roses in tall vases, guests in suits that cost more than my rent leaned into each other, trading stock tips and real estate gossip. I was seated near the back within earshot, but never part of the circle. My father introduced me to an older couple. "This is my son, Ryan. He works in event security." The way he said it, flat and dismissive, turned the words into something smaller. A woman smiled politely. A man offered thanks for my military service. And then the conversation drifted back to IPOs and investment funds. I clenched my fork until my knuckles went white. Years of therapy told me to breathe, to let the air in and out until my pulse steadied. But across the table, my father leaned closer to another guest and muttered, "If he'd listened, he'd be a lawyer by now." I set my fork down. I wasn't going to take the bait. Later in the hum of the service hallway, I caught sight of a man in an ill-fitting server's vest. The fabric sagged at the shoulders. His shoes were scuffed, not polished the way every other staffer's were. A thin scar cut across his left ear. His eyes weren't on the plates he carried. They were sweeping the room, lingering on the table stacked with wedding gifts, then sliding to the exit door at the eastern end of the hall. I bent down a few minutes later to pick up what I thought was a dropped napkin, only to find an ID badge on the floor. The laminate edges were rough. The barcode scratched the printed name slightly off-center. I'd seen counterfeit work like that overseas. Out of habit, I pulled up a Sentinel app on my phone and scanned the code. It pinged back not as an employee, but as guest vendor. Someone had slipped through the wrong door. I carried it to Frank, the head of resort security, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, and the posture of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He shrugged. "Probably a vendor from Seattle. Happens." His dismissal lit something sharp in my chest. "That's not standard," I told him. He just waved it off. At dinner, my father's words came again like clockwork. He laughed with a cluster of men in bespoke suits, then looked over and said loud enough for me to hear, if he'd followed my plan, he'd already have a corner office. My fork rattled against the plate. I forced myself to inhale, then exhale like the therapist had told me. Don't give him the satisfaction, but I couldn't shake the details piling up. A skewed evacuation map taped near the exit. A corridor camera with its status light off the backup generator in the utility room freshly marked with a stripe of paint as if someone had tampered with it. When the night wound down, I stepped outside to the balcony and texted Tyler. Something's off here. The Lake Washington breeze was sharp, pulling at my shirt, and as I lifted my eyes, I saw the sconce lights along the wall flicker once, twice, like a warning. The party laughter drifted from inside, but all I could hear was the faint groan of the wind against the glass. And in my gut, a certainty tomorrow was going to demand everything I had left. I didn't sleep. Not really. The resort quieted to a low, mechanical hum, and I slipped into the corridors like a shadow, a guest playing at being invisible. I walked the loop again and again, mapping doors and dead zones, counting cameras the way other people count sheep. Along the service hall, I watched Harris settle into his rhythm. 2-minute passes, then a smoke break by the loading dock, then a chat with the bartender. Routine is a comfort for some people. For me, it's a warning label. Routine is where someone else hides. The staffing board in the back office told its own story. A printed schedule had been edited in thick pen during the toast. Tomorrow, half the floor team would be supporting a jazz performance. No one pulls service at peak without a replacement. It wasn't just sloppy. It was the kind of gap someone plans around. In the kitchen, I paused at a crack in the swinging door and listened. Two voices, fast and low. "Wait for the chandelier signal," one said. "East gate," the other answered, impatient, like they'd said it a dozen times. The click of metal came next, practiced hands assembling something in pieces. Through the slit, I saw the same server from earlier, the one with the vest that hung wrong and the scar along his ear. A black glove tugged his cuff straight. He wasn't watching the food. He was tracking the doors. I pushed out toward the vendor lot on the eastern side. Sodium lights washed the concrete gold. A white van sat there without a logo, clean enough to pass, but blank enough to disappear. The plate number snagged on my brain a middle string with 8M3. I'd read an internal bulletin at Sentinel about a series of event hits in the Northwest and a recurring plate pattern. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was a bad feeling earning its paycheck. Either way, I took a photo. I called Frank again. I kept my voice flat and gave him what I had reduced staffing during the toast, the off-uniform server, the van. "We should tighten checks on vendor passes and double the patrol on the eastern side," I said. He sighed into the line, long and tired. "We've got people already. Groom's family brought in extra help." He said it like that settled it. Who, I asked. "A friend of Mr. Cole. Don't worry about it." The name never came. The vagueness did. It landed like a stone. Standing there with the Lake Washington breathing cold air over the lot, I felt the old fear trying to climb my throat. That I'd speak up and get labeled dramatic, obsessive, needy. That I'd be that kid again, the one who couldn't take a joke. But a different voice answered it. The one I earned overseas. The one I trained into muscle. You don't wait for permission to keep people safe. You take the first step. I started taking pictures. The electrical panel that had been left unlocked. The backup generator with a fresh smear of paint along the casing like someone had dragged a tool case against it. The van, the exit door on the eastern side, and the hinge that looked recently cleaned. I made a list in my phone and then rewrote it by hand so it would stick. Verify all exits at dawn. Locate the kids' table and pre-stage cover. Identify the best lines of sight. Brief anyone who will listen without panicking them. Keep Walter away from the eastern corridor no matter what he thinks of me. In the linen closet, I checked the stock and found the heavy fire-retardant cloths we use when vendors do open-flame service. Good cover if you know how to hold them. Near the kitchen, a CO canister stood ready by the door, metal and dependable. In the maintenance alcove, I opened a breaker box and found a secondary switch labeled in thick marker chandelier. If you wanted to dim the room without killing it, that's where you do it. Back in the hallway, a kid in a suit brushed past, craning out a selfie light from his phone, jumping across the glass like a nervous pulse. I heard my father's voice in my head, lazy and careless. "Sit wherever, just don't draw attention. If they couldn't see me fine, I'd see everything." I walked the dock, came back through the lobby, and returned to my room when the resort had gone fully quiet. Lake Washington kept time against the shore. I fell into a half-sleep and dreamed of pulling a man out of the dark while glass rained from somewhere above us. The sound was too real. I woke into a flicker. My room light stuttered once, then steadied as if someone had touched the system with a careful testing hand. My phone buzzed on the nightstand with a late email from Sentinel, a bulletin update. The crew we tracked had resurfaced last week method, unchanged a brief power dip to shift attention, then a grab when the crowd lifts their glasses and looks up. I set my alarm for earlier than early. I placed the broken watch face up on the dresser. Tomorrow, I'm on mission. I told the room. The second hand didn't move, but it didn't have to. I knew exactly what time it was. I ran the Lake Washington path just after sunrise breath, pacing to the slap of sneakers on damp wood. Running doesn't cure anything, but it puts the noise in order. On my way back, I cut past the eastern exit and saw what I was afraid of. The auxiliary padlock that had been hanging there last night was gone. The door looked legal, compliant, and easy. Access is a story a door tells, and this one was saying, "Come through me." I showered, put on the navy suit I'd had altered to hide a shoulder scar, and walked down into the day the planners had built. The resort gleamed. Staff moved like choreography. Guests arrived in waves, perfume-polished shoes, laughter that floats when people know they're being watched. I checked my phone again. No reply from Frank. No name for the outside team my father had arranged. They seated me at a back row during the ceremony, right where you place a distant cousin or a courtesy invite. I could see everyone. Almost no one could see me. The vows started soft and earnest under the arch. The Lake Washington was a sheet of light behind them. I tracked the staff pattern, counting beats between service passes, measuring the distance from the gift table to each exit. The server with the scar moved through my frame like an undercurrent. He scanned the gifts, then the door, then the ceiling lips moving as if reciting steps. A waiter cleared a glass without making eye contact. Another drifted into position without the usual nod to a guest. The chandelier in the side hall blinked 3 times. Once, twice, 3. Then a single breath of darkness. I didn't look away from the aisle, but my pulse changed. Behind me, a woman whispered that the lights are temperamental near the kitchen. Of course they are. People will rationalize anything that keeps the party going. I stood and stepped into the side corridor. The resort's private radio channel hissed in the pocket of a man in a perfect black suit, a coil in his ear that wasn't plugged into anything. He adjusted his cuff scanning like a tourist pretending to be a bodyguard. "Who are you with?" I asked quietly. He gave me a company name that sounded expensive and nowhere. "Who's your supervisor?" I pressed. He smiled like I'd told a joke. He didn't smell like duty. He smelled like cologne. Back in the main hall, a final run-through swept the reception space. The gift table was ridiculous metallic envelopes, velvet boxes, a watch case with a name etched in gold. Someone laughed near the bar about the insurance rider. I checked the eastern door again and found a subtle smear near the push bar, a polished, clean line where fingers had wiped before me. The kids' table had been set with crayons and favors close to the wall. I marked the tablecloths within reach, heavy enough to pull into a shield, and the path from there to the marble column I could use as hard cover if the room broke. Guests drifted to the cocktail lawn. I stayed near the seam between the sconce-lit corridor and the fringe of the reception, trying to live in 2 worlds at once. My father passed close enough for me to smell his aftershave. He didn't stop. He didn't have to. He'd already told me who I was. I walked the route one more time, letting my feet learn it the way my hands once learned a rifle. Entry, pivot, cover, exit. I checked my phone battery, the spare pack in my inner pocket, the placement of fire extinguishers, the weight of the heavy linen on my forearm as I lifted one corner to test the drape. Across the room, the server with the scar looked up at the chandelier like a man waiting for rain. 2 more in matching uniforms eased into a triangle around the gift table, moving with a precision that had nothing to do with serving drinks. I stood in the aisle of a life that had decided where I belonged and felt the old heat rise. Say something and be the problem. Say nothing and become part of the problem. I drew a breath to speak to the nearest staff lead, but the band started a soft run and the coordinator lifted a hand places. The crowd swelled back toward the room, the doors opening to admit a fresh wave of laughter and clinking glass. I stayed where I was for one more count of 3, watching the lights, the exits, the faces that would soon look up the Lake Washington that had been a mirror all morning, now rippling under a wind that had finally decided to arrive. My hand hovered over my phone, the emergency number ready. I didn't know yet if I would interrupt a wedding to stop a disaster, or if I'd be the fool they humored for coming at all. But I knew what I was here to do. I was here to keep people breathing. I was here to see what no one wanted to see. And somewhere beyond the glass and the flowers, and the music that chandelier was still speaking in a language I understood. Late afternoon slid into that soft, expensive light planners pray for. Violins feathered the air where the Lake Washington breathed in long silver lines, and beneath the rose arch, people lifted flutes of champagne like the world had never broken. I stood near the seam between lawn and hall, tracking faces, tracking doors, letting the sound wash over me without letting it in. That's when I caught it, the faintest curl of smoke where there shouldn't have been any. It wasn't kitchen smoke. It was colder metal tinge, the kind that slips out of wiring that's been treated wrong. I followed it with my eyes to the trim above the side lighting, saw a fresh bite in the sheath where a cable fed the chandelier rig. I took 2 steps toward the service corridor, but the officiant's cadence shifted and the guests turned as one. The couple reached for each other, hands shaking with joy, and then the room shuddered. The chandeliers blinked, held, and dropped into a hush of near dark. It wasn't a full blackout, just that breath of shadow that makes a crowd lean up on its toes. Glass stemware kissed teeth. A woman gasped. The band skittered off time. The eastern door opened on its breath latch, and 5 silhouettes poured through in a line that was not service. Steel cleared fabric. A single shot cracked the ceiling, and the scream it harvested tore through the lawn. People scattered chairs, toppled roses, shook their pollen into the air. In the near dark, the gift table gleamed like a lighthouse for wolves. I moved before my fear could. One of the men pivoted toward me and then stilled. His head tilting like memory had a taste. He stepped in close enough that I could see the ghost of a nick along his ear. "Seattle Center," he hissed, voice gone private. "You nearly ruined us, soldier." My chest tightened. The line between coincidence and pattern disappeared. Another shot went off a warning into the rafters, and the crowd convulsed again. My father appeared in my peripheral vision, pushing through bodies toward the eastern corridor like a man certain the exit he'd paid for would open for him. He stumbled on a fallen chair. A server shrieked. I threw myself into the gap and took him by the shoulders, turning him behind the pillar as a blast of splinters rained from a wooden beam overhead. My dream came back in a flash of sound glass falling. And this time I was awake, and this time I was fast enough. The sound hit me in the bones. The old noise, the one that drags you across a desert night by the ribs until you forget what gentle means. My hands shook. I lowered to a crouch and forced air through my teeth. In through the nose 4, hold 4, out 6. Breath is a metronome when nothing else holds rhythm. The shaking eased enough to let training take the wheel. The man with the scar swept his muzzle across the room, counting with his weapon. I timed the sweep and closed. My left hand pinned his wrist at the tendon. My right drove up under the forearm to break the angle. He spat a curse, wrenched, and I stepped inside the line heel, down hip through, turning his center into mine. The gun skittered across marble. I caught the back of his neck and used momentum to drag him to the floor. He bucked once, twice, and then I had his breathing under my hand and his face on stone. Somewhere behind us, a child cried. 2 of the crew were already at the table, raking velvet boxes into a bag. Another had taken a position by the western doors, waving people back with the flat black of his weapon. That made 4 I could account for. The 5th drifted toward the service hall. I looked at my father. He stared at me like I'd slipped out of a television and into his life. "Stay behind the pillar," I told him low and even. He nodded, and for the first time since I could remember, his eyes were listening. I zip-tied the man I dropped with a cable pulled from the mic cart and kicked his weapon behind a column. The room surged and fell in waves as guests tried to decide whether to run or freeze. I chose for them. Down I called to the cluster nearest me. Not a shout, but a command made of steel and practice. Crawl along the wall, not the center. Cover your heads. Move when I tell you. A woman grabbed my sleeve. Please, she said, voice torn raw. Please. I guided her toward the wall and stood long enough to mark the remaining angles, 4 still moving 1 down. The door at the east gaped like a second mouth. I could feel the night gathering outside it. I stepped toward the corridor, and the man I'd faced at Seattle Center hissed laughter into the floor, a sound of recognition and promise. I tightened the zip and left him breathing through his teeth. The plan forming in my head was simple because it had to be protect the cluster of kids near the wall. Protect anyone caught in the open. Keep the predators divided until help could get through whatever net they'd thrown over our signals. The violins had stopped. Lake Washington kept going. All that water moving like nothing had changed. Inside, the dark had found its foothold. I moved anyway. The ballroom smelled like hot wires and spilled champagne. Someone had knocked over a pyramid of glasses, and the shards flashed under the emergency lights like a field of salt. I spotted the kids' table tucked tight to the wall where the planner had wedged it for space. A dozen small bodies, eyes wide and wet. I upended the nearest banquet table, drove my shoulder into its edge, and rolled it onto its side to make a shield. Under, I said, crouching to their level, "Stay low. Hold hands." A little girl with a ribbon in her hair clamped onto my fingers and wouldn't let go. "You're okay," I told her. "We're staying very small and very quiet." Across the floor, a woman in her 70s clutched her chest and sagged against a chair. Her companion was shaking too hard to hold her up. I grabbed a linen as thick as a welding curtain and moved like I'd been taught, fast, not frantic. "Mom, I'm a medic," I said. And in that instant I was won, because a voice with authority is the difference between panic and motion. I got her to the floor behind the overturned table, loosened her collar, checked her eyes, counted a breath, and then passed her hand to the girl with the ribbon. "Hold on to each other," I said. "Don't let go." The crew split the way crews do when they've rehearsed. 2 kept scooping gifts with one eye on the exits. 2 controlled the doors with short arcs of their arms, menacing in economy. The 5th shadow slipped through the kitchen doors without a sound. I went after him, pushing through the swinging panel into a heat that was clean stainless, humming with refrigerators. He had a young server by the wrist, her face bleached with shock, as he shoved her toward a locked steel compartment where high-end liquor waited for celebratory photographs. "Open it." He snapped the barrel of his weapon, pressing a crescent into her skin. I spotted the CO cylinder by the doorway safety pin, clipped nozzle intact. I lifted it, thumbed the lever for a half-second, and sent a white hiss of cold into his face. He recoiled on instinct weapon hand, rising away from the girl. I crossed the distance in 2 strides, turned his forearm with both hands, pinned his elbow to my chest, and rotated until his knuckles scraped steel. He lost the gun when pain made a decision for him. I put him down with a shoulder choke, tight and quick, until his fight dropped like a trapdoor. The server stumbled free, shaking. "Go," I told her, steering her toward the staff exit. "Find anyone in uniform who's actually working and tell them to get people low and away from the east. If you see my father, keep him where he is." She nodded so hard her teeth clicked and ran. I pushed back into the hall and nearly collided with a man in a black suit standing as if waiting for room service. His earpiece coiled into nothing. "Move," I said. And when he didn't, I reached up and tugged the line from behind his collar. It wasn't connected to a transmitter. He blinked, startled, then tried to sell me a name that wasn't worth the cologne he'd soaked himself in. My father had bought theater. Theater doesn't stop bullets. My phone vibrated in my pocket, 911, returning my earlier call, and died into silence the second I answered. The bars on my screen vanished, then reappeared thin and useless. Static crawled the line. Jammer. Small, portable, common enough if you know where to shop and don't mind paying in cash, which meant we were alone until sirens found us by sound instead of signal. I moved for the corridor, and a round took a bite out of the doorframe an inch from my shoulder. Heat carved a line over my deltoid. I slammed against the wall and felt the sting spread that hot, cold bloom that tells you what you already know. I tested the arm. It held. Pain isn't the point. Movement is. Somewhere in the hall, a guest shouted a name. Somewhere else, glass fell again. I pulled the small admin app we use at Sentinel, a maintenance back door that pings camera nodes for diagnostics. It's not a control panel, but it gives you eyes when the main system lags. I ran the ping and watched a scatter of feeds populate in thumbnail gray. One camera on the east gave me the angle I needed. 2 men canvassing with sacks now half heavy. One sweeping the crowd with his weapon every 7 seconds, counting, measuring, waiting for someone to be stupid. Another feed showed the kitchen hall empty now. The 5th man, the one I choked out, stayed down. I pushed to the eastern wing and palmed the crash bar on the outer door, then dropped the manual bolt into the floor sleeve. The door had been left compliant for flow. Now it would hold. I slid a linen-wrapped chair against it for good measure. I could not make the building a fortress, but I could make this mouth stop chewing. Back in the main room, I caught the eye of a bartender crouched behind the marble. "Fire extinguishers," I said, and he pointed with his chin. I kicked one toward the center where the kids hid and rolled another to the wall where a cluster of guests crouched. "If smoke builds, stay low and sweep side to side," I told the nearest man. He nodded, face gray with fear, knuckles white around the handle. I needed civilians to have jobs. People with jobs don't panic as hard. I checked on my father. He was still behind the pillar hands, shaking against the stone skin the color of paste. He looked at my shoulder at the blood darkening the seam of my suit and opened his mouth like he might say he was sorry. Later, I said not unkind, just true. He swallowed, nodded, stayed where I put him. The violins were gone. The band leader crouched with his hands spread, waiting for a sign I could not give him. The men at the door hardened their perimeter frustration, starting to leak into their posture. The sacks were almost full. The chandelier lights sputtered again as someone played the building like an instrument. And then underneath it all, faint as a memory, I heard the first thread of sirens finally stitched into the wind off the Lake Washington. The crew heard it too. You can tell by the way a man's shoulders change when time runs out. One of them grabbed a guest by the collar and yanked him upright, pressing the muzzle to his throat. Another swept toward the cluster of women near the wall and hooked an arm around a stranger's waist, turning her into a shield. The room inhaled and didn't exhale. I stood up into the open where they could see me. My arm burned my heartbeat hard enough to make the edges of my vision hum, but my steps were steady. I raised my hands away from my body and spoke like I was talking to a skittish animal. "Look at me," I said. "I'm right here." If they were going to point their fear at someone, I wanted it. I needed it. I was done being a shape in the background. I was the one who saw the angles. I was the one who would move first. They started taking hostages. One man by the collar, a woman yanked from a huddle and held as a shield. Sirens threaded the wind outside but hadn't reached the drive. I stepped into the open with my hands high, voice even. "Look at me," I said. "Eyes here." Muzzles lifted off the crowd and settled on me. I used the clipped cadence I'd learned in places that never see weddings, offering routes and clocks a crew could grasp. The tall one up front weighed me, then edged closer. "You want out?" I told him. "The Lake Washington Road is jammed. The only clean lane is the one I show you." His eyes flicked where I pointed with my chin. That was the breath I needed. My forearm cut his wrist. My other hand drove into the soft plate below his sternum. Air left him in a grunt. I turned him into me. Center became mine. Glass burst above the bandstand. A bottle shattered, peppering my arm. Heat flared under my sleeve. I kept the leader pinned, scanned the truss, saw a gun hand quiver along the rail. I climbed the steps, jammed his elbow to steel stripped, the weapon dropped him clean. The room rang, then flattened. Back on the floor, the leader clawed for his pocket. Not surrender reach. I planted a knee between his shoulders, ripped a buzzing black brick free, and smashed it to the marble. The static died. My phone leapt alive. I fed dispatch positions count and the eastern door I had bolted earlier. The line carried every word. One of the crew ran for that door anyway. The bar didn't give. He spun to find uniforms coming through the main in a calm, hard V. The others felt the turn and loosened their grips. I slid the leader toward cuffs and finally saw my father stunned behind the pillar where Id left him, looking like the story he'd told about his son had stopped working. Light crawled back through the chandeliers. A flicker, then a steady wash. People sobbed, then held each other. I stood breathing metal and stale flowers' blood drying into my seam. Ryan, my father said, but he meant, "Who are you?" I didn't answer. The room already had. At dawn, the Lake Washington was tin and the air smelled of cleaner and wilted roses. A paramedic rinsed my arm while a detective took the short version. "You killed their jammer," he said. "If you hadn't, we'd have walked blind." Another officer nodded at the hall. "You kept them breathing." By mid-morning, the footage looped across Seattle. Me hauling a man behind a pillar taking a gun moving people low. In the lobby, a TV glowed. Someone whispered, I was the reason her son went home. My father stood off to the side and watched. The investigation stripped the shine from the extra security had hired. No licenses, no training, just suits. He signed the statements without protest. Out by the water, he finally said I was wrong. "I didn't see your work. You protected my guests. You protected me. We couldn't fix years in a morning, but we could move an inch." Weeks later, Sentinel handed me the training unit. I rewrote checklists with what the ballroom taught me. The city gave me a citation at the Civic Center. My mother cried. My father didn't try to stand in the light. Months after a station asked about labels, I said, "A title isn't a measure. It's what you do when the lights go out." A year on, I spoke at a gala at the Fry Museum about safety as dignity. Afterward, my father pressed a box into my hand. Inside lay the same watch he'd given me now, ticking smooth. "Figured it was time," he said. We walked a block without performing. Sometimes I stand by the Lake Washington and let the wind slip through me. I think about the kid with the ribbon, the bartender clutching an extinguisher, the woman who squeezed my sleeve and begged please. I think about how a life turns on choices no one plans to make. I was called just a security guard for years. Then the room went dark, and I chose. The watch hums at my wrist. The dream ends in light. It stands.